Hello there, and welcome to the I Am Barabbas podcast. My name is Reggie Thiel, and we are on week 2 of our weekly Torah readings. I hope everyone has had the time to be able to read through the passages for this week. You can see them listed for you on the screen there. The title of this week's reading is Noach, which is rest. That's the meaning of the name Noah, in case you kind of missed that fact, which was mentioned in the reading this week. If you remember, the readings are just named or titled on the first couple of words in the first verses of the very first passage that comes from the Torah. So we have Genesis chapter 6, verse 9, and so you see the very first word there is the word. It says this is the lineage of Noah, but Noah is kind of like the main subject, so that's where the title comes from. And so anyway, I hope everybody had a chance to read through the passages before watching the video. I think it really helps to kind of have your own understanding, your own kind of view on what you were able to read. I really think that the Holy Spirit works as a teacher through our own experiences and backgrounds and just even theologies, and because there are a lot of differences out there in terms of eschatology and everything else, and ecclesiology, or how church should function, how end times go. So I apologize for using the fancy words. Don't mean to do that. So we can have different views there. And so when we read these passages, those views can come out in forms of biases or whatever. And not that those are right or wrong. I just find it really interesting and really important that we all have those differences, and that you read and you take notes and you see how you understand it, and then you can watch and see how I read and how I understand it, and just kind of then see if God is maybe trying to share something through all that noise of everybody's backgrounds and histories and stuff, and try to get to some kind of truth that is meaningful and that can help us grow in our knowledge of him, right? And I think that's kind of the goal and the whole thing, as I mentioned last week, as to why these studies even started. So here we go. Genesis chapter 6, starting in verse 9. Again, not trying to go verse by verse, really just looking at the themes that are being communicated to us through the scripture. And again, that's through my noise, through my history, my background, my experiences. And so this is just the way I've seen it. And ultimately the goal will be to do these live, so that more people, so that whoever's watching can kind of we can have input and have more of a community feel around these Torah teachings. So last week I saw this pattern of speaking, and how speaking led to a path that would either expose us to light or expose us to darkness, us being as human beings, and how at the very beginning somehow there was darkness, right? And God spoke, and then there was light. And then when the enemy spoke, it led to a path that led to darkness again. And then God has to speak again concerning their decision to sin. And in his speaking, he speaks curses, but he also shares light. I don't think I specifically covered, chapter 3 and the promise of a seed of the woman that was going to, crush the serpent's head. Which is why when Eve gave birth to Seth, she's like, oh, wow, I've had the man of God. I mentioned the whole creation thing, but also just the idea, here's the man that comes to, crush the head of the serpent for us. He's the light that we're looking for after the darkness that we fell into, right? So light and darkness, light and darkness. And I bring that up because it's really interesting with the First Peter passage to understand kind of what's happening here in terms of the sin that leads to the need for a flood, according to the book of Genesis. And we looked at that last week, but the sin was the sons of God, so it's angels from heaven, looking upon the daughters of women, thinking that they're beautiful, and making a decision to go down into them and start, having children with men, and start interbreeding, I guess you would say, with angels and humans. And if you understand the promise of God to give through the seed of a woman a man who is going to crush the serpent's head, you can understand the plan as well as fallen angels come down and try to disrupt God's plan, right? Try to disrupt God's plan in such a way where the human seed is corrupted and God is unable to fulfill the covenant he has. At least that's a thought that exists with some who study these things and maybe go into things a little deeper than most of us do. Uh, and it's just things I've studied. So anyway, looking at that, that's where we left off, and now we have Noah, and it tells us that Noah is a man who has found favor in the eyes of God. And verse 9 tells us that the reason why he has found favor in the eyes of God is because he's a righteous man and he was blameless in his time that he walked with God. Right? So Noah was righteous, he was blameless, and he walked with God. And the writer of Genesis then goes ahead and repeats for us a lineage here, like Noah's three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And so it kind of tells us that the story is the writer's kind of starting a new story, and then he starts after the writer gives us the lineage again. It looks at repeating the information that was just given, the idea that the earth was corrupt and before God and filled with, as they describe, outrage. Some Bibles may say violence, wickedness, evil, so on and so forth. The idea is that the earth has become full of a very specific type of sin, and that's anger that leads then to murder, vengeance, murder and vengeance, and just that kind of violence, right? And in fact, that's where the word Hamas, if you've heard of the terrorist group or the organization over there in the Gaza area, that word Hamas means violence, and so that name was chosen for that reason, so that they could communicate that to the people of Israel. This is what their purpose is, or this is what our purpose is. And so the earth was filled with this violence, and it's an issue that God will address after the flood. Okay, but in terms of how to make sure this doesn't happen again this way. But before the flood, he's looking at it and he sees what's going on with all the people. And in verse 13, God speaks again. He says that the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with outrage against violence by them, and I am now about to destroy them with the earth. Make yourself an ark. And so there are the instructions for the ark, and that actually closes out chapter 6 with in verse 22, something's really important that I highlighted there, and you can see it says that Noah, and this Noah did as all that God commanded him. So you have a person that the writer of the book of Genesis describes as righteous and blameless in the eyes of God. And so he becomes a person that God then communicates to, and he tells him to build this ark. And he gives them all the details about the ark and who's going to be coming into the ark, and the animals and the sons and the wives and all that kind of stuff. And very simply ends with, and this Noah did as all that God had commanded him. So you have a blameless and righteous person who's spoken to by God, and then he obeys God, and he obeys God in action. Okay, it doesn't say that his faith is simply believes God, like he's like, oh, okay, I believe God, and I have faith in you, and so that's it. No, he goes ahead and completes his faith in obedience by doing the thing God has asked him to do. Okay, and I think it's a really important part to bring up, because it comes up again in chapter 7. God then speaks to Noah. So a time has passed. In Genesis chapter 6, at the end of last week's reading, we can ascertain that it's about 120 years between God's decision to judge the earth and then bring the flood. So the assumption is that it's around that much time, I should say, that Noah is perhaps building the ark. Seems like a long time, but maybe it took that long. I don't know. It could be shorter, obviously. But whenever that time passes, we know it's 120 years since God decided to do this thing. And so in chapter 7, he speaks to Noah again, and he says, this time, come into the ark, you and all your household, for it is you I've seen righteous before me in every generation. And then he continues to repeat the instructions he had given earlier. And then at the end of verse 5, you see, and Noah did all that the Lord commanded him. So you have a blameless and righteous person, as described by the writer of Hebrews, and then you have God then speaking to this person, and again this person obeys, and in that obedience they show that they have faith, right? That he has faith, that he understands. So faith and obedience, faith and obedience. And this concept of faith and obedience really came into mind because of my history, my background, and my understanding of the book of Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 11. In our circles, we called it the Hall of Faith, right? So it's, just that listing of people of faith and the actions corresponding to the faith that they had. And the writer of Hebrews, in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 7, I do have that on the screen, reads, it says to us, by faith, Noah, when warned about events not yet seen, in holy fear prepared an ark for the safety of his household. Through faith, he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith, right? So there's an idea here that Noah, he's acting out of faith and obedience by doing something for something he's never seen before. Right? The idea that there's a flood is coming, the understanding of what the earth was like and everything else, and time periods and epochs and ages and millions of years or billions of years, only thousands of years, all that stuff. I don't particularly, think we need to get into all that, but for Noah, the idea of a flood that was going to cover the earth is something that's he's never seen. And despite that fact, he's willing to go ahead and obey God and do as he's commanded, and that obedience is counted as faith, right? According to the book of Hebrews, that it's through faith, by faith and a holy fear, so like a reverence for God. That's faith and holy reverence and obedience. They all kind of work together, and through that faith, because he believed and he obeyed and he did what God told him, he then condemned the world, because what we understand then is the rest of the world was in no way, shape, or form obeying God or revering God or listening to him in any kind of way, or doing anything related to what it is that he wanted them to do, right? And so the passage continues, the story continues in chapter 7. It tells us that Noah was 600 years old when the flood came and water came over all the earth. And again, I'm not interested in getting into whether or not, this is just the earth is like the whole globe or just the area, and how much time this was. All of that stuff I think is a huge distraction from what we're trying to understand here through these readings. And I think what the writer of Genesis is trying to communicate to his reader, or to their reader at the time that they're writing. And I think through this story, what we're seeing is the creation of the world, the bringing in of light and darkness. Then you have the words to Adam. Are you going to obey Adam? Are you going to revere? Are you going to in faith trust and do as I commanded? No, I'm not. Then Cain, are you going to stay away from sin? Are you going to go into light? Are you going to darkness? Or you see the pattern there, and then how humans then expand out of that, and then it tells us that Cain's descendant Lamech is proud of the fact that he's murdered somebody, a young boy, he's bruised and all this kind of stuff, and he's just like proud of the violence that he's committed. And so you see like humanity's gone in one way, and then you see Seth's ancestors or descendants, I should say, go a different way, leading to Noah. And that's I think what the story is really about, is seeing the difference in people and their response to God. And so you have light, you have darkness, you have violence, you have people who are considered righteous, blameless, so on and so forth. So again, if you read it and you're looking at it and you're thinking about the times, all this stuff, that's fine. Again, I'm not trying to judge anybody who's focusing on those things, but I'm just again trying to figure out, hey, what is it that God's trying to communicate this week to us in these passages? So we go to chapter 16. Again, there's a reminder that God had that he did everything that God commanded him. Noah alone remained, and those with him in the ark. So go ahead to chapter 8. And in chapter 8, what we see is that the waters begin to recede. And I wanted to point out that at the end of chapter 7, it tells us that the ark rests the seventh month and the 17th day. I think that was at the end of oh wait, no, that's in this chapter. So sorry. So the waters start to recede. So you see in verse 5 here on the screen, the waters continue to ebb until the 10th month. On the first day on the 10th month, the mountain tops appeared. So there's a timeline here. What's the 10th month, the 12th month? It's widely believed that the writer was familiar with the months as established after the people of Israel left Egypt. So if it's Moses who's writing, he'd obviously be aware of the new calendar that God has given them, and so those months are in relation to that calendar that God started when they left Egypt. Like today, this will be the first month, and so on and so forth, right? So again, it gets back and it tells us that the ark rests on the earth on the 7th month and the 17th day, but Noah waits another 7 months to the 2nd month and the 27th day to come out. All right, so that's just a note that I picked up, and because I was just thinking about this idea of obedience. Noah is extremely obedient. I mean, if you are in this boat for so many days, like 150 days or something, and then the water starts to slowly go down and months pass, and then at some point the ark stops floating and it just rests on top of a mountain, and it's the 7th month and the 17th day, but then you're just like waiting to come out. And he sent out the dove, and he was looking, trying to see if there was land. Obviously, he was curious. He had a window he could see, and yet he waits another 7 months to the 2nd month, the 27th day, before God says in verse 15, go out of the ark. And it just, again, spoke to me about how obedient Noah was to God, how obedient he was to God, and how, again, in Hebrews chapter 11, through his faith, his obedience was seen, right? Or sorry, his faith was seen through his obedience, right? Because if God, tells you something and you believe in that thing, well, then it would make sense that you would obey that thing that he has told you, right? By doing the thing that he has told you. And that's just a sign of faith, right? Especially when you're talking about something you haven't seen before. Noah has never seen a flood. And yet he went ahead and did as he was commanded. And at this point, it's got to be easy for him. If God's speaking to him, go out and do it. He can obey. And then it tells us what's interesting in verse 20 is that he builds an altar to the Lord. And what I find interesting there is that it doesn't tell us that God actually told him to do it. And I have my reasons for thinking that this was actually something that Noah came up with on his own. Right now, he was considered a blameless and righteous man, so I'm not saying he was wrong for doing it at all. But I do think this was something that Noah thought he should do. And I think the language at the end of verse 21, it says, and the Lord smelled the fragrant odor of the burnt offerings of the altar, said in his heart, I will not again damn the soil for humankind's score, for the devisings of the human heart are evil from youth. I will not again strike down all living things. And what I'm saying here is that God smells this odor, and then he speaks to himself, right? And so I feel like this act of Noah was one of reverence to God. It was an act of worship. It was something that he said, I want to do this. I want to be thankful. It's seen as an act of thankfulness and sacrifice to God. What you could eat for yourself. You're just getting out of the ark. Maybe you didn't want to kill any animals while you're there. It's bloody, it's messy, or whatever. But you get out. Maybe you've been craving some beef or whatever you want to have, and so you're like, okay, let me kill a bull and eat it. But no, I'm going to kill it. I'm going to offer it to God and say thank you for getting us out of here and for delivering us and all that kind of stuff. And then the smell of the sacrifice, the intention behind the sacrifice is what God is smelling. Okay. And he says in his heart, as a result, he starts to make a covenant with himself that he's then going to share with Noah. And that covenant is this, that he won't do this type of thing again, flooding the earth, right? And the reason why is because he knows in verse 21, he says, the devisings of the human heart are evil from youth. So he understands that just because he flooded the earth and kind of is starting over, it doesn't mean that it's not going to go bad again. He just understands that the human heart is just, it's going to go bad again. So what he's saying to himself is, even though I know it's going to go bad again, I'm not going to choose to just end everything the same way. Right? That's a promise that he first makes to himself, and then speaks to Noah in chapter 9. Right. So you notice, I noticed the structure here in chapter 9. You have him talking to Noah and his sons, much like he talks to Adam at the beginning of Genesis, the first human male. And now he's talking to the only human males, right? This concept here. And then he's saying to them the very same blessing of purpose I talked about last week, how when God speaks, it leads to light. It can expose darkness, right? When he curses, it exposes the darkness of our decisions. And now again, he's speaking in light and blessings. Like so he exposes light by helping us understand the blessings, or in other words, we know what light is when he describes to us the blessings that he's giving us. And he repeats that the same blessings that he gave to Adam to Noah and his sons: be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The dread of the fear of the animals, everything else should be under you. All stirring things that are alive, yours shall be for food, like the green plants. That I highlighted because I think that's a little different. But he says in verse 4, the flesh is lifeblood, you shall not eat. Right, so there's some extra instruction being given here, because I think the idea of like eating animals is kind of a new one. And so, or I don't know, maybe not a new one, but just God's starting to put, not that it's new, is that God's starting to put boundaries around it. If you remember, talked about last week, the idea of fences, boundaries meant to protect us from sin. And so what God is saying here is you can go ahead and eat the stirring things that are alive. You should have as food. That means you can eat the things that are living. And I've given that to you. But the flesh with its lifeblood, so if you're going to eat it, do not eat it with the blood, right? That's kind of a general guideline I'm going to add to this situation now. I don't want you eating the blood. And I think it has to do with the sin of murder and violence that has existed since the time of Cain and existed through all those generations afterwards, and then filled the earth, right? And the reason why I think the text supports it in verse 5, it says, and just so your lifeblood I will requite, or I will require it from every beast, I will requite it, and from humankind. And what he's saying is in verse 6, he who sheds human blood, by humans his blood shall be shed. So God is now putting a boundary again over the death of other humans, whether by beast or by humans. And the reasoning for it is that the blood of a human and even an animal is something different that needs to be respected, revered, understand as being the source of life in a human and in all living creatures, and that comes from God. And so that's something that has to be respected from now on. And what I mean is that it's a difference from what happened with Cain and even Lamech. If you remember, when Cain murdered Abel and Abel's blood cried out to God, Cain was like, please don't send me out there, because God said, I'm going to banish you, right? So it seemed like God's method of dealing with the sin of murder and the shedding of blood was to just banish a person from his presence, from that air, from his land or whatever. And Cain's response was, oh, please don't do that. Then if they find me wandering the earth, they're going to kill me, right? And so he was worried about someone else murdering him. And then God said, no, I'll put a mark on you. That way, anyone who kills you will know that I will return, killing you a certain X amount of times. So God felt at that time, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it so that people murder somebody, I'll put a mark on them, and then they'll understand that if they murder them, I'm going to come back at them 7 times fold, right? But by the time you get to so it sounds good, like, oh, well, I'm not going to kill that guy because if I kill that guy, God's going to come after me. But it seems like it just kind of continued anyway. That people kind of didn't care, and maybe it was the effect of the Nephilim or the Nephilim, the resulting you know children of fallen angels and women. I don't know, but they just kind of went crazy with it, and the violence just grew. And so God, at this point, is saying, from now on, if someone does shed someone's blood, then then basically you execute them. We don't let them live and say don't touch them and vengeance will come. No, we're going to go ahead and kill them. And then he closes out his teaching or his blessing with, as for you, be fruitful and multiply. And so there's a huge difference, right? With Adam, it was all blessing and light because sin hadn't entered the world yet. After sin entered the world, sin entered Adam and human beings, then God's speech is now showing us which path lead to light, which paths I should say lead to darkness. And then he goes ahead and establishes the covenant of never flooding the earth again, and the symbol of that covenant is the rainbow, right? So I'm not going to spend too much time going through that, but that's the middle part of chapter 9. Now, so once we get past all that, so it says God says I will remember my covenant. So God creates a covenant with Noah and with all human beings, with all life on the planet, that he'll never flood it again, right? And we looked at the reason why, because he knows we're going to mess up again, so he's not going to go this way again with it. And so when it rains, when the rain stops, we're going to see a rainbow, and then it's going to remind him of his promise, okay? And it's going to remind us of his promise as well. Then in verse 18, the narrative changes, and it goes back to that lineage as mentioned at the beginning of the reading and at the end of last week's reading, that Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And Ham was the father of Canaan. And then he goes ahead and tells us this narrative, this really interesting narrative. It talks about how, first in verse 19 it says, and these 3 sons were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth spread out, meaning everybody that's involved with the story of Israel and their history, they come from here, right? That's actually a clear understanding of what that phrase meant. But it certainly could mean that's where every human being came from, right? Again, it just kind of depends. And I don't want to judge and I don't want to create controversy, but there are people who say the flood was only, over that region, that Middle Eastern region, and that's where the flood was. It was a localized flood. And so like people out in China, or, if they're there, they're there. The whole thing is, I know it's hard to understand, but I think I'll prove the point about what this is saying, the whole earth spread out, in just a little bit, looking at the rest of these passages, especially in chapter 10 and the table of nations. Now, getting back to this passage, it says that it tells us that Noah, a man of the soil, was the first to plant a vineyard. So he seems to be the first one to plant, grapes, and from that he makes wine, and he becomes drunk, right? And whether or not getting drunk was wrong or whatever, can't say. The text doesn't tell us here specifically, but he does that and he exposes himself in his tent. So you get drunk, you lose kind of control of your prefrontal cortex and the things you're going to do normally, and you do the things you hold yourself back from doing. You do it freely, and so he got naked and went to sleep. And it tells us that Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father's nakedness and told his brothers about what he saw. Now, as a result of doing that, Noah, Shem and Japheth cover him, but Noah, finds out about what happened and what Ham chose to do, and he gets upset about it, and he curses Canaan. Now, notice that the cursing and the blessings that come, they don't come from God, they come from Noah, right? And the curse is directed at Canaan, who is one of the sons of Ham. Now, it's hard to tell exactly from at this point, like when these kids were born, like were they on the ark or so on and so forth. There is some timing put to it later on about other children that are born. Shem's first kid being born 2 years after the flood. The idea is that they did not have any kids while they were on the ark, and that they came out. Some time passed. Ham had Canaan. Canaan was not his first son. I think Canaan was his third son. So when this event happened, there was time. The kids had been born. Their families had grown. It wasn't just just after the flood. And so so he cursed Canaan, and as we saw there in verse 18, Canaan is one of Ham's son, and he says Canaan will be the lowliest slave he shall be to his brothers, and then he says he blesses the God of Shem, which is interesting because he didn't say that, like, does Shem believe in this God but not the other two? The language is interesting in the way that it's written. It says, blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem. Unto them shall Canaan be a slave. Right? And so when Joshua and Israel go into the land, the promised land, the Canaanites are there. And those are the people that they have to conquer. And those are the people that they then, turn into their workers and their slaves and their servants, and rebuilding cities and working for them and to get their nation started. Right? And so that's part of the understanding here of what this curse means. In verse 27 it says, may God enlarge Japheth, may he dwell in the tents of Shem, unto them shall Canaan be slaves. So slaves to both. And the enlargement of Japheth is interesting because it doesn't say the God of Japheth. He just says, may God enlarge Japheth, means let him grow and be big, like have a big family, a big ancestry, a big line of descendants. But may they dwell in the tents of Shem, indicating that the dwelling places of Shem are the places that will be the places of blessing. And those places, those dwelling places, I believe, are blessed because Shem's God is the Lord God, the same God of Noah. Right? How everybody went off to their own places after the flood and everything else, I don't know. But that's what I think is being communicated here for us. And remember, Moses, Moses is the one writing this. This is many, many years after all of this has happened. And Moses has the perspective of knowing who's in the land. The Canaanites are there, knowing where these descendants are and their relationship to God. And so he could just be writing with a present perspective, writing it back into history. And so he knows that the descendants of Japheth aren't believers, and he knows who the Canaanites are, and he knows who the descendants of Shem are, and how they're the only ones that are honoring the one true God, right? So he could just know that, and so he's writing it that sense. But then again, what about Noah? Is he prophesying? Did he really prophesy? So you can get kind of stuck in that logic. But either way, that's what Noah says. It tells us that he lives some more years. He lives to like 950, and then he dies. Now, there's a lot here, and I'm trying to get through. I'm already at 30-something minutes here, so I need to get through the end of Genesis, the Genesis passage, and then get into the Matthew and 1 Peter passages. Oh, and there's Isaiah. Whew, bear with me. So, chapter 10 is the Table of Nations, and I think to save time, I'm not going to go ahead and go into detail here, but you see that the sons of Japheth are Gomer, Magog, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, Tiras, and then the sea peoples go from there. And then you have the sons of Ham. You have Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. And from Cush you have Babylon. And then from Canaan you have all the Canaanites, the Hivites, Amorites, all those people that are there. And that's communicated to us later on in the chapter. I wanted to point out, you could read Ezekiel chapter 38 on your own, and you'll see these same names, Cush and Put, are named, and Magog, and I think Gomer also. And they're described as the peoples, I should say, that at the end time, right, when there's a big gathering of nations to fight against Jerusalem, to fight against the God of Jerusalem. In Ezekiel chapter 38, you see these names repeated. And so what Ezekiel is saying through the prophecies of God is that, these are the people that come up against us. And so by reading these genealogies, what you're seeing is then where they came from. And so all of even the enemies of Israel, those who surround Israel and go after Israel, or those that Israel has to deal with on a regular basis, and you're never going to drive the Canaanite out. They're always Canaanite out, and they're always going to be a thorn in your side, just words spoken to to Israel later on, because of their refusal to go into the land, or actually as a consequence of not completely eliminating the people there, then you go back to this, you see where they came from, and that's where that's what I think the importance of all of this is. And if you notice, the very first kingdom that's mentioned then was the start of Babylon. That comes from Cush, and that was the leader was Nimrod, and he becomes the focus of chapter 11, right? Chapter 11. So chapter 10 is called the Table of Nations. If you go into it, you can see it plainly lays out for us the future characters of the entire, history of Israel and all the different peoples that they have to deal with in different ways for different reasons, and then the people that they're going to have to continue to deal with all the way into the future until the days everything is kind of done, right? And so it ends, chapter 10 ends with that, telling us that those are the clans of Noah. Chapter 11 continues with the tale of Nimrod. Nimrod and the people there, they're gathered together. So this is before they all separate. Like, it tells us where Nimrod comes from, but this chapter tells us why everybody scatters out, why everybody divides. And it's because God sees them building this tall tower, and he's saying, if they can do this, they can do anything. And so he wants to confuse their language and spread them out. And so that's the story of the first half of chapter 11. And then you have at the end of chapter 11, you have the lineage of Shem given to us. And if you notice at the very end there, you have the mention of characters that we're going to become even more familiar with, and that is Abram and Lot. Abram later becomes Abraham, right? And Lot and Sarai, who later becomes Sarah. And so the story is building up to, okay, how do we get from the beginning to then Abraham? It's from Noah to Shem to Abraham, right? So it's Adam to Noah to Shem to Abraham. That's kind of the lineage there, and how that works out, and why God continues to be the God of this line is because of their blamelessness and their righteousness in the eyes of God. So, in Isaiah, in our Isaiah passage, Isaiah 54, we have I don't have it open here. Let me open up here. So Isaiah 54, we have written for us a portion that reflects the eschatology of the nation of Israel after the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar. Excuse me. So I'm not going to go through all my notes because I don't think I'm going to have time to then go through Matthew and 1 Peter. So I'm going to summarize it and try to be as efficient as I can with this. Again, if you need to take a break, go ahead and take a break. I want a break, but we're just going to keep going here. So Isaiah 54 and Isaiah 55 are really interesting chapters in the book of Isaiah, because they mark the end of what's considered to be the end and beginning of what's considered to be second Isaiah and third Isaiah. Now, a lot of people who don't go, into seminaries and study Bible colleges or whatever may not be familiar with these books, that they even exist. They just see the book of Isaiah and they're like, oh, it's one book. It's strongly believed, based on the writing styles, okay, and the messages, and then the context and everything that's in the passage, that Isaiah 1 through 40 was written by the prophet Isaiah and was written before the conquest of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. Okay, then 41 through 54, written by someone who's familiar with Isaiah, so perhaps one of his contemporaries, someone who was worked with him, studied under him, however that might have worked. But because of the information that's given to us in the writing, it has the feel of it was written after the destruction of Jerusalem. So in Isaiah 1 through 40, you see this is going to happen, this is going to happen, this is going to happen language, and afterwards, like, this has happened, and you are weeping, and you have been you've been forsaken. In fact, in this passage, in the Isaiah 54 passage, it tells us that that the nation of Israel is feeling like they have been forsaken, like a wife of one's youth that is rejected. Right. So he says in verse 7, "For a brief moment I deserted you, but I will regather you." So the idea is that Isaiah 54 was written in a time where the exile has happened. They are now, people are gone, like Daniel. They're gone into Babylon, and we know from study history that exile happened about it was a 70-year time period, according to prophecy even said by Jeremiah. And so for God, he says, "A brief moment I deserted you, but I will regather you. I will regather you," right? And he says later that he's going to get you from the north. He's going to get you from the south and from the east and from the west. And so that's the language of at the end of 54. Then when you get into 55, you have the language again changes. And so perhaps another contemporary, and it's considered that that Isaiah 55 to the end of Isaiah was then written after the return from the exile. And the theme of Isaiah 55 onward is focused on the last days, on the time when God will reign on earth in Jerusalem with his people, right? And which was a growing thought in eschatology and theology. That's what it became. Their theology became that after the exile. And just so knowing from history and time, why is it all one book? Very simply explained that they were separate scrolls, and that over time, as you're copying these scrolls, and the scrolls are big, that it was easier to copy them and put them all into one scroll so that you don't lose them, feeling like they do belong together. And so it's kind of like sections. And then as we have it in our Bibles, we're just copying from the scrolls that we have, translating them to English, and so we just put them. Remember the chapter verses and the chapter numbers and the verses, everything else. Those are all made up by us pretty much, and we're trying to find natural divisions and add a verse number so that we can be organized. But ultimately, so we just have the one book, right? So it's not something that's like a secret or whatever. It's known. You can read it and search it up yourself. So in chapter 54, the language is, "I was angry. I am now going to have compassion on you." And why is this passage included with the Noah passages? It's because of verse 9. When God speaks and says, "For this is like the waters of Noah to me. For as I swore that the waters of Noah should no more cover the earth, so I have sworn that I will not be angry with you." And so the reason why this portion is chosen to be read with the Noah portion is because it links together two covenants between God and his people. With Noah and all the humans, it's to never flood the earth again. But with God and his people, it's to secure them in their place in a forever way. Okay, in a forever way. Now, obviously, if you know your history of Israel, maybe not obviously, sorry if I say that's kind of pretentious, but even after their return, they suffer through insecurity and being dominated by other nations, right? They never are again set free. After they return by permission of the Persian Empire, then you have, the Greeks come in, which by the way is Javan, mentioning, earlier from the Table of Nations. And then you have the Greeks come in, then you have the Romans come in by the time of Jesus' time. And then when the Romans come, they, siege and destroy the temple again. And so if you read this and you're like, wow, man, but so God says, like, I will not be angry with you, I will not rebuke you, though the mountains depart, my love will not depart from you, nor will my covenant of peace be shaken. Well, again, in the context of the entire passage, and also Isaiah chapter 55, what's actually going on here is a prophecy regarding the coming kingdom. Okay? And how do we know that? Well, in chapter 54, verse 2, there's a mentioning of, "Enlarge the place of your tent, stretch out your tabernacle curtains, do not hold back, lengthen your cords, strengthen your stakes, for you will spread out to the right hand, to the left. Your offspring will possess the nations and will resettle the desolate cities. And then verse 5, for your maker is your husband, Adonai Zevos, Lord of armies is his name. He will be called the God of all the earth. And that's where we understand, oh, this is language related to that idea that one day God is going to establish his kingdom and his reign, his throne, literally on earth. And verse 2 is a very interesting verse because talk about your tent, your stakes. And I learned about this when we did our study in Zechariah. But in the earlier, so in the first part of Isaiah, there was the mention of, so it's Isaiah chapter 22, verse 25, the mention of the removal of a tent peg. And the allusion was the removal of the dynasty and their ruling power and the position of power in Israel, right? In Judah and Jerusalem, having that removed. Isaiah 22, 25. In Isaiah 33, 20, there's the prophecy of a tent peg that will be established, one that will never be removed, one where the Lord dwells. So I know the theology and eschatology of God dwelling grew and expanded exponentially after their return, but the idea did exist before, as evidenced by Isaiah, the early part of Isaiah chapters 1 through 40. And that's why everything is combined together, because the book of Isaiah really is about that time when God is going to reign on earth. And so with that in context, we can look at the book of Matthew. Okay, in the book of Matthew, in chapter 24, verses 36 to 46, we see Jesus speaking to his disciples. And his disciples have just heard him prophesy about the fact that not one stone of the temple is going to be left for anybody to see, right? After they were marveling over Herod's temple, which by all accounts was a beautiful temple, had gold everywhere, and was amazing to behold and to look at. Then after Jesus says not one stone is going to be left behind for anybody to look at anymore, they go to the mountain of Olives, they meaning Yeshua and his disciples, and then they speak privately, and then they ask him, this is the beginning of chapter 24, when are these things going to happen? When is the sign of your next coming? So as time progressed from their return from exile, then you have Ezra and Nehemiah, and they're establishing the reading and the weekly reading of the scripture, and then you have all the history that they go through leading up to the time of Jesus. Now the Romans are in charge. They have their temple, but they're not free, and they don't see God dwelling with them. They don't see, the festival of tents, and they don't see the shining lights. And I mean, Peter had a glimpse of it, and that's why he wanted to put up tents, because he's like, oh, this is it. God is now dwelling with us. Let's set up tents. Let's celebrate the festival of tents and God's reign. But they had missed the first part of the prophecy, which Zechariah actually talks about, the fact that the Messiah was first going to be one that they pierced, right? And so they sit with him privately on the Mount of Olives. They still haven't grasped the concept that he's going to die, as evidenced by the scripture. And so Jesus is concluding his remarks about what they should be expecting. And then he says, but on that day and the hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven or nor the Son, except the Father alone. And he says, for just as the days of Noah were, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage until the day Noah entered the ark. And they did not understand until the flood came and swept them all away. So shall it be at the coming of the Son of Man. So Jesus is explaining what it's going to be like in Jerusalem. And I do want to emphasize this, because I think a lot of believers, and it's just like, I think, really bad teaching, out of context teaching. Jesus explains like all this stuff that's going to happen, this tribulation, this war and destruction and everything else, nations rising up. He's specifically speaking about Jerusalem and these words, and he tells them, like, when you see this thing, like, flee to the mountains. And his words actually get fulfilled by like 67 AD to 70 AD when the Romans sieged Jerusalem, and his followers actually listen to what he says, and they flee when they get a chance. There's a moment where the Romans siege Jerusalem, so they surround the city. And at some point they decide to let people out, and the believers of followers of Jesus are like, he taught us to get out when this happens. And then the Romans go in and they kill like 1 million Jewish people. And the reason why the Jewish people stayed is because they believed that the Messiah would be coming to rescue them. And there's a prophecy in Zechariah that his feet would touch down on the Mount of Olives, and the Mount of Olives would split open, and that he would walk through, and that the enemies who surrounded them will then be defeated, and he comes with his holy ones, and so on and so forth. And Jesus is telling them, listen, first there's going to be a destruction. There's going to be a destruction of the temple. Not one stone is going to be left. And that's what happens here in Jerusalem. The rest of the world is going to be eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage. And the reason why I say a lot of people get this kind of twisted, it's like, yeah, we could be, if you're living in Ukraine, Russia, whatever, there's war, and you're like, man, it's just crazy. And maybe if you're a believer, you're like, oh, this is the end times. But really, it's about war in that place, in Jerusalem, being surrounded by the nations and having constant conflict, which if you're watching this today, it's November 6th, 2024. Certainly that's happening. Israel is striking all over the place. And then you just wonder, at what point are the nations going to come back to strike against Israel, right? Iran sends missiles over. It doesn't seem that effective, other than just arousing the anger of Israel and Judah. And so, say what you say. But the rest of the world, for the most part, is going to be eating and drinking and marrying and giving him, and so it's basically what we're doing now, right? The election just passed, and I don't want to minimize all that. It's all important in a lot of different ways, but as all of that is happening, we're living our lives. Last night I was playing soccer. I have plans to play soccer on Friday. I have plans to travel and plans to go on flights, and we just continue to go on living life, right? And what Jesus is saying is, when I come back, it's going to be like that for the world. Things are going to be rough in Jerusalem, and it's kind of happened twice, which it happened in 70 AD and expecting to happen again. But the rest of the world is going to be just living their life. And what it is I want you to understand is that when this happens, you don't know when it's going to happen. Verse 43, what's important to me is that you keep watch, and that you understand that he's going to come at an hour no one's expecting. And then I'm going to decide, and I'm going to ask, verse 45, who is the faithful and wise servant whom the master put in charge of his household to give them food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whose master finds him doing so when he comes. And what Jesus is saying is, who's going to obey, and who's going to listen, and who's going to serve as he commands, right? Because he's saying all of this stuff's going to happen. Jerusalem's going to be covered, is going to be in war and suffering and everything else. The rest of the world is going to be going on and drinking and eating and marrying and so on and so forth. But who among my servants is going to be faithful to my words and my teaching, and is going to feed my sheep at the proper time? Right? So that when the time of his coming is near, and when it happens, who will be actually teaching his sheep and guiding his sheep? And if you remember his conversation with Peter at the end of the book of John, he's like, feed my sheep, feed my sheep, feed my sheep, attend my lambs, right? Just over and over again. Jesus wants to know who's going to be faithful and do so. And blessed is the one who the master finds him doing so. And that's where then we turn to 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 18 through 24. And what's really important to understand here is that Peter is writing this right before the time leading up to the Roman siege. And again, the death of like 1 million Jewish people. Really actually kind of, like a 4 or 5 year period, I think. And so Peter was asked at the end of John, are you going to feed my sheep? Right? Jesus just asked Peter and his disciples, who among you is going to be the faithful servant to feed my sheep? Who's going to be faithful? Who's going to be obedient? To give them the words that they need to persevere and get through this time, because for the people that are here in Jerusalem, it's going to be exponentially difficult. For the people outside of here, the world's just gonna be going on. Jesus even said, "Woe to those who are pregnant at that time; they've got to flee." And I can imagine, that time. And this is like a historical thing. Recently, kind of just studied and learned about it's believed, right? I don't know if it's 100% proven, but it's strongly believed as a miracle by God that everyone who belonged to Jesus, belonged to Yeshua, and had been baptized and followed him, was able to escape, because the teaching by the disciples, by the servants, was so strong that they understood that when they have a chance, they have to get out, right? Flee the city when you see this thing happen. And this passage is an example of how Peter taught the people, those who belonged to Jesus, his sheep, how he fed them, right? So he says in verse 18, and you can reread the whole thing. You'll see he's explaining what it's going to be to suffer. He's explaining how to live in chapter 2 once they are forced out and they're now living under the rule of a different king and different places. And so he's giving them advice on how to survive while they're out there. But then in chapter 3, he's kind of closing with this last advice about suffering for sin, that Messiah suffered for sins also. So he's like, you're going to suffer. Jesus also suffered for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, in order to bring you to God. So he was brought to death. He was put to death in the flesh, made alive by the Spirit. This Bible says Ruach, but you see it in italics. Some Bibles may say the Holy Spirit. That's why also in verse 19 says through the Ruach, or through the Spirit he went. So basically what I'm trying to say is he was made alive by the Spirit. Is this about the resurrection or about the time between the resurrection? And because there's it's not so widely understood or accepted, most Bible translators will just use the word Holy Spirit, but it's in italics because they understand that the original word is just the basic word for spirit, which would then indicate that Jesus did this thing during the 3 days in which he was buried. So he died by the flesh, but he was still alive in spirit, right? But made alive by the Spirit. His body was dead, but his spirit was alive, right? Something we all believe about ourselves when we die. And through the Spirit, in that time period when his body was dead but his spirit was alive, he went down and preached to the spirits in prison. Now it's like, whoa, Peter, what are you talking about? We're about to face persecution. We've been dealing with persecution. Now we're going to face it like we haven't seen in a long time, not since Nebuchadnezzar was here. And you're talking about Jesus going to preach to spirits in prison. That long ago they disobeyed God, while God kept waiting patiently in the days of Noah as the ark was being built. That ark, that is 8 souls, were brought safely to the water. It's like, what is he talking about? Well, in the book of Enoch and even when you look in the book of Genesis, there was, and Jude quotes from the book of Enoch. So there's an understanding that this generation, they read the book of Enoch and they kind of took it to what it means. And there's an understanding that the 120 years that God talked about before, when he said, I'm going to, leave this for 120 years, was a sentence for the angels that come down from heaven and then, corrupted the seed of man. That was like their punishment before the flood would then come upon the earth and then undo all the things that they were trying to do, right? Trying to ruin God's plan to bring a redeemer out of the seed of the woman, as mentioned before. And so apparently these spirits remain in prison, and so Jesus as spirit went into this prison. And what's interesting is most commentators agree that the word preached here is not the same idea of the word preached used for preaching the gospel, because some might say, oh, he went to preach the gospel so they could be saved. That's not really said. It's really like proclaimed to the spirits in prison. Proclaimed, meaning he went down there and showed them, hey, look, what you tried to do to disrupt the plan of God by corrupting the seed of human beings, it failed. It failed. And so now your judgment is is known. Now your judgment is justified because you tried to do this thing to disrupt God's plan, but it didn't work. And so God was right to lock you up because you were going to continue to, try to stop his plan from working. But then, so again, but why is Peter bringing this point up? In verse 21, it says, corresponding to that, meaning that the ark saved a few people through the flood that came to destroy the work of those spirits. Corresponding to that, immersion, which is another word for baptism, now brings you to safety. So, like the ark brought those 8 souls out of judgment of the floodwaters and saved them, so immersion brings you to a safe place. All right? Not the removal of dirt from the flesh, but a pledge to God of a good conscience through the resurrection of Messiah Yeshua. And so there are some who use this passage to explain that baptism is necessary to be saved. Now I see that I'm up at an hour. I got to finish this thought, right? So please excuse me for going long here. But I just want to explain this last point. So is baptism a way for salvation? That's not what Peter is saying. What Peter is saying is immersion is going to become your opportunity to make a final pledge to God about who it is you believe in and who you follow. And so in taking this step, it'll clear your conscience of your previous decision to deny him. Remember, these are people, Peter's writing in 60 to 65 AD, right? That's our early estimate, leading up to the fall of Jerusalem. They have been established in Jerusalem now for 20, 30 years, depending on the dating, when Jesus died, resurrected, so on and so forth. Again, 20, 30 years. They've been doing the work of sharing the gospel, sharing the news of Messiah, and again, to the same people that Jesus himself would have preached to. The same people that most likely rejected him. If you don't know what Jesus' ministry looked like, his disciples and the people that followed him, the big crowd, just mostly came out of the northern part of Israel, from Nazareth and Galilee and all those Capernaum and all those places that were around the Sea of Galilee and in that area. When he comes down into Judea and he comes down into Jerusalem, that's where he starts to meet extreme amounts of pushback, right, against his claims of being the Son of God. And so these people, whether they're the exact people or descendants of those people, the children of or whatever, they were people that rejected him. And then after the fact, they had to deal with the fact that they, in their conscience, might have been part of the groups of people that even saw him on the cross and mocked him, or at least mocked other believers, or even turned believers over. But through the work of the Spirit and through the preaching of the gospel by the disciples and those who were faithful to the message of Yeshua and through the Holy Spirit, they came to be saved. They came to be a part of the very community they rejected when the leader was there. And so what Peter is saying is, building up to this, we're about to go through some suffering here, and it's going to be rough, but I know that some of you, or a lot of you, in your conscience, you have this thing in your mind that originally you rejected him. And now, and maybe even after you got quote unquote saved, or you became a believer and came into the community, you still didn't want to get baptized because you didn't want people to know that you've switched to the other side, right? You kind of want to keep that private. Okay, but I'm writing to you now that if you want your conscience to be totally clear, you want to be saved from that type of condemnation, right? and be brought through this in a way where your mind and your conscience is clear, now is the time to get baptized. Because what did immersion do? It declared to everyone who saw it and to the whole community. And again, people like Paul, or Saul persecuting the leaders, it was all a big thing. It was trouble. It wasn't easy. Stephen being stoned, the first martyr. If you're going to do this, you're declaring to everybody and to God that you do believe and you are part of this thing. And through that, you could be saved, right? Brings you to safety in that you no longer have anything weighing you down or burdening you down about your previous decisions to not make this declaration public. That's my understanding and a lot of people's understanding of what Jesus is saying here. Now, what Peter is saying here. Now, I understand there's perspectives where they say, no, this means that you have to be baptized to be saved. I'm tired, it's late. You have to be baptized to be saved, and that's what this passage says. Okay, if that's what you think, okay, that's your opinion about that. I'm just sharing what I think, what this means, and again, tying it together is that all of this together is that ultimately God has provided a way of safety through the troubled times, through the judgment. And that safety comes through faith and obedience and a commitment to the words of God. In Noah's time, the words of God was, build this ark. So faith and obedience and holy reverence, he committed himself to the words of God, and he did the thing that God told him to do, even though he had never seen anything like it before. In the book of Isaiah, God says, I'm going to make a covenant with you, and the covenant I made with you is like the covenant I made with Noah. It's going to be a forever covenant, and it's going to be established in the time when I dwell here with you on earth. The Matthew passage, disciples, so when is that time going to come? When are you going to dwell here on earth? When are we going to have this everlasting covenant where we no longer have to worry about being forsaken or that we're not, safe in our own land, in our own place? And then Jesus said, XYZ is going to happen. The world's going to go on as it goes on. It's going to be eating, drinking, and everything else. The trouble is going to be in Jerusalem, and there's going to be war. And what I want to know is, you want to know when is it going to happen. What I want to know is who's going to be faithful, who's going to be obedient, who's going to be committed, who's going to revere God, who's going to listen to his words and act through that. And Peter's words for the people that lived in a time, much like what Jesus was describing in Matthew 24, a time that we as believers, because the world hasn't ended and all that kind of stuff, and Messiah isn't here, but you believe it's going to happen again. Peter's words were, commit yourselves, show the commitment through an act of faith and obedience, and be immersed. Let everybody know. The same way that Noah and his sons let everybody know that he believes. Remember he said that by building the ark and doing the thing in Hebrews that he proved his faith in God by doing the thing God told him to do, right? And his sons too going in with him. And so Peter is saying to these people now, be baptized, obey the full commandment of Yeshua, because he said to go out, he told us to go out and to baptize, to make disciples and to baptize of all the nations, right? And so obey and follow the teachings of God. And who's going to be the faithful servant? I hope I didn't, I hope this all made sense. This is really kind of deep stuff. It's stuff I've been struggling with and wrestling with. Okay, what does this all mean? And that's the conclusion that I've come up with for myself, and the one that I thought that the Spirit wanted me to share with those who are listening. I thank you again for your time. I thank you for reading the scriptures with me, and I really do look forward to the time when we can kind of all do this together, meet each other on a more regular basis, and be able to share our opinions and thoughts and get and dive deeper into these things as a group, as opposed to just me doing it by myself. But until then, again, look forward to the next posting of the scriptures, which will be Friday. I'm hoping Friday night. I've got to remember. And then read the scriptures, study them, and then we'll talk about them again next week. Thank you for watching, and I pray God's blessing upon you and your household.